one of the key lessons that I learned is to really have a vision and core values. We've just announced 500 million in ARR.
Wow.
So it's really a very fast organization. Now we have to run very quickly to deliver hires and make sure that there's business continuity.
Alan, good to see you.
Thank you.
Welcome, and welcome to the Leaders in Talent podcast. Our audience is mainly senior recruitment leaders and leaders in talent. Given your role as head of talent at Deel, tell me a little bit more about your journey and how you ended up being the head of talent at Deel.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me, firstly. So I'll start with my current role. So I'm Alan. I'm the global head of talent acquisition at Deel.
Yeah.
So we operate in over 100 countries where we have clients with various different service providers from payroll through to EOR, et cetera. We have employees in over 105 countries, and typically serving north of 2,000 kind of new hires every year. Deel are a 4-year-old organization, so it's pretty crazy in terms of the growth, both in revenue and people and operations, etc. So there's 4 main areas that we typically tend to recruit for. One is our revenue teams, so sales, account management, sales development representatives, some of the infrastructure stuff around kind of revenue operations, etc. You've then got our operations team, which is around customer success, onboarding, payroll implementation, all of these kind of customer supports. You've then got our G&A functions, so finance, legal, HR, etc. And then fourthly, you've got our R&D teams, which is tech, products, and data. So those are the 4 main areas that we support. And then we've also got, within my team, we've got TA operations and programs. And number 6, we've got a sourcing team that support the 4 other departments. So it's pretty interesting. Prior to joining Deel, I was part of the founding team of a micromobility company called Dot. So we operated across Europe. I think we got to about 11 or 12 countries during my time there and grew it from 0 employees when I started. We didn't have a name of the organization and grew that to 1,000 staff in 4 years.
Wow.
So it's pretty interesting.
Amazing. Let's zoom a little bit into your current role at Deel. So Deel, one of the fastest growing companies ever. Tell me a little bit more when you started at Deel and kind of what was the environment that you were operating in and what was the challenge that you were facing as a head of TA?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason why I wanted to join Deel was coming back to the prior company, Dot. So in 2018, we started. We didn't have entities, we didn't have employment contracts. We were trying to figure out how to expand into new markets. And creating entities, creating all of these things was a big problem. And prior to that also, during my time at Uber, which is another organization I worked at, we also faced a similar problem in terms of expanding payroll, going into new entities, employment contracts, legislation, all of these type of things. So that's what led me here. Then when I joined, it was really interesting because I think you'll find in a lot of organizations, especially if they've experienced kind of hypergrowth, you tend to see that the maturity of your R&D teams, your maturity of your sales teams, if it's a SaaS-based organization, and operations, you typically tend to see a little bit more kind of mature. And then from a talent acquisition perspective, a lot of the mindset is about, here's a vacancy, how do I go and fill it as quickly as possible, and all of these things. And whilst a lot of that is valuable, is really important, you have to think more broadly about what is a TA function, right? So as I came to look at the TA function, I split it into a number of different categories. So firstly, it was the people. How do we make sure that they have the right understanding about the roles in which they're recruiting for? Being able to make sure that we're targeting recruiters in the right way. So what measurements, what is success in terms of kind of recruiting, right? And the TA enablement. You've then got like the processes as number 2. You've then got the architecture in terms of technology. So applicant tracking system to use. Do you want to invest in tools like MetaView, for instance, for artificial intelligence, et cetera, around the interviewing process? What skills do you want to evaluate? So that could be testing tools that you would buy from a software platform. et cetera, et cetera. You've then got some of the strategy around employer value proposition and employer branding, D&I initiatives, et cetera. And then the final thing is like, how do you bring it all together in terms of a program kind of function? So a lot of that was there, but it wasn't necessarily kind of mature. So a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past year is about maturing a number of those different categories.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about the type of company that Deel is for the people that are unfamiliar with Deel, and what makes Deel a unique environment. And then as a follow-up question, what was the challenge when you really started off, what you just described, and how did you break that down of what to focus on?
Yeah, so I think Deel is one of these organizations that has just grown so fast, so quickly. So, this is publicly available information now, but I think the first year in terms of ARR, they got to 5 million in ARR, which is insane for first year, right?
Yeah.
Second year, they grew that to 50 million. Third year, 300 million. And we've just announced in, today's date, which is around March in 2024, we've just announced 500 million in ARR.
Wow.
So it's really a very fast organization. Now the core product that we started was employer of record.
Yeah.
So EOR.
Yeah.
And that would basically mean that if you wanted to hire a software engineer in any country, let's say Poland, right? Yeah. But you didn't have the legal framework, i.e. the entity, employment contracts, all of these areas, then you would start to get into, difficult surroundings to be able to onboard and have that worker work for you, right? So we started with this EOR product in which we can then kind of hire compliantly around the world. We started to see then a big opportunity. So that's our core product, right? Yeah. But we started to see that we're building a fintech business ultimately and payments business in order to pay a lot of those EORs around the world. Yeah. And then we started to see big traction in payroll software to be able to not only payroll EORs that we would service for our clients, but also run payroll internally for a number of other organizations. So we've just announced a number of or not just announced, but we've partnered over the last few years with a number of large organizations to run their global payroll. Yeah. Right. So I think that's really interesting as we start to dive more into it. We've launched a HR information system. Yeah. To be able to firstly integrate EORs into existing HRIS tooling, but then equally having a standalone tool to be able to run a lot of the HR topics that you would tend to see in a HRIS. Yeah. We've just acquired a learning management tool with Zavi in the last couple of weeks as well. So as we dive more deeper into actually kind of bringing a lot of the functionality that people and HR leaders and TA leaders kind of need today, to integrate that into kind of one platform. Yeah.
Are you facing market volatility, need to hire quickly, or have a team that sits idle? Meet Matcher, your flexible recruitment and sourcing partner. Scale your recruitment capacity up or down without compromising on quality. Trusted by Booking.com, Miro, Heineken, Grammarly, and Deel, Matcher is the RPO disruptor making waves in Europe and the US. For scale-ups and corporates, Matcher covers engineering, go-to-market, and G&A roles. Visit Matcher.io to see how we can support you. That's MATCHR.io.
So when you started, Deel, super fast growing, fully remote. Yeah. Your recruitment team, you've never seen in person. Yeah. Very high targets. Explain to us kind of like what those first 3 to 6 months look like for you. How did you shape order in the chaos?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting it's an interesting one. I think that the volume of hires has always been there, right? Because if you look at our revenue teams, for instance, it's quite a simple calculation. You have a certain amount of people that then equals kind of quota and attainment and targets, and then that equals a kind of geographical kind of expansion, right, into new markets. You then have the R&D teams that need to support that in terms of features and infrastructure. You've then got our operations team around customer success, onboarding, payroll implementation, payroll management to be able to run payroll in a variety of different countries compliantly. So you typically tend to see that there's a high degree of investment that you need in order to grow. So that means that we have to run very quickly to deliver hires and make sure that there's business continuity. But in the first 3 months, 6 months or so, it's like, well, hey, what are the skills we're looking for? How do we evaluate those skills? Who should evaluate them in the interviewing process? And in what format should we evaluate? And we had to do a little bit of work around what are the functional skills that someone's really looking for? What are the functional practices?
Yeah.
So if you take, for instance, software engineer, your functional skills of Node.js or Java,
yeah.
but then waterfall methodologies in terms of practices, et cetera,
yeah.
and like pace and speed is something where we need to evaluate. Then you look at your behaviors and your culture, right? Are these the type of people that you want to have in the organization? Do they align with your culture? All of these areas. And then fourthly, you've got your business impact to make sure that, you're actually delivering real value over time. And then how do we assess for that during the interview process? So I think that was a key piece of work that we did at the start of 2023.
Yeah. In terms of running a fully remote team, how do you make sure that everyone is aligned on what you want to achieve and what you're driving and to have that same buy-in in terms of your strategy?
So
for the team?
I mean, it's interesting because when I during the pandemic, right, everyone went remotely.
Yeah.
And I was of the mindset, because I was running a people function at the time, I was of the mindset that obviously everyone wants the pandemic to end very quickly, right?
Yeah.
But I was super motivated to try and organize office events and bring people back to the office and really drive that collaboration and that communication, those water cooler moments, all of these things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I was pro coming back to the office 5 days a week, but I wanted to have that blend and that in-person meeting. And then I've just changed my perspective over time, actually. I think there's certain values and certain benefits that you can get in working fully distributed and remotely, for access to talent and really objectively evaluating the hiring bar, because it doesn't necessarily matter, especially for our population, where you're actually based, as long as you're time zone centric and you know your functional skills, practices, behaviors, business impacts, all of these things. In terms of getting people aligned, I think it starts very clearly with what is the purpose? What are you trying to do, right? That starts at the organizational level, and then how do you disseminate that into your team? Trying to have that personal connection, so you're able to bring people through with your vision, right? But then also be very clear about what are the the main objectives that we need to achieve, and then how do you provide that support and that framework? We have to do a lot more in terms of it's very similar to pandemic days, but really trying to do in-person, remote events. So we would do games nights and all of these things. And I think one of the real learnings that I've had, especially going from a fully distributed global workforce, is Slack is your office.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is really great in terms of connectivity. But if you've got if you've got employees in 105 countries around the world, it's always on.
Yeah.
And you have to set certain boundaries with, you can't just leave Slack on all of the time. You have to set periods that you're away and that do not contacts and all of these things to make sure that you just don't go fully immersed in work, right? And then being very clear with your colleagues as well around times in which, it's your evening or it's your morning, because if you look at Slack at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone's going to be up.
Yeah.
And there's a real adjustment that I think people, and I definitely made that over the first 3 to 6 months. There's a real adjustment that people have to really just think, oh no, it's going to be great. We're going to go to this work from home anywhere kind of environment. And there's certain considerations that I think people need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Kind of switching gears a little bit, right?
Sure.
You've seen a lot of different well-known companies. You've been in leadership positions. If you look back to Alan a couple of years ago and where you are now, what would you tell yourself in your first management role? Like, what were some of the mistakes that you then made, and like, what have you learned over time?
Where do I start? Like what was the first mistakes that I was making as a manager? There was a lot. I think that being instructional and telling someone how to do it as if you were doing it in your way, right? I think that's kind of lesson kind of number one. I think people need to just kind of figure out and develop their own kind of pace and ways of working. I think one of the key lessons that I learned is to really have a vision and have have core values. And I spent my former CEO at Dot, Henri, he says to me, Alan, what are your values? And I was like, well, I've got values. And he's like, no, but what are they concretely? Yeah. And I was like, well, okay. And I couldn't reel off, these are my 3 values or 4 values that I really kind of care about. Yeah. So he's like, go away, have a think about your values, and then make decisions based on your values and not necessarily on the individual circumstance. Because if you're then guided by your values, then you become consistent. Yeah. And if you take decisions at face value, it can then mean that you actually you are inconsistent. And that's probably, if you ask a number of different people, like working with people, if there's inconsistency, it creates confusion, and then you're not sure which way to turn. And then it actually stops innovation, it stops all of these other things. Yeah. And that it's okay to fail kind of mentality, right? So be very clear in terms of your vision and your principles and your values. And then you become, I think, a lot more consistent with how you approach a variety of different challenges.
Is it something that your team also knows in terms of what you find important and what your values are?
It's a good question. I'm still learning, right? So I think in general, yes. But you continue to have to over communicate. I think that's one of the lessons also that I've learned in my career, is that continue to repeat, continue to bring everyone back to the actual main objectives that you're trying to achieve, over communicate. Yeah. If you tell someone one more time, it doesn't necessarily kind of matter too much in terms of the strategy and the vision kind of piece. Yeah. And always linking back. There's a really interesting book that I read, Measure What Matters. I wasn't sure, can't remember exactly who authored it, but if is everyone very aligned in terms of your objectives, and then you measure what really matters, if you don't do anything with that number, stop measuring it. Yeah. And that was one of the other learnings that I really kind of resonated with me, right? So then it's just very clear, there's 3 or 4 things you really pay attention to, and those are your defining kind of principles.
Yes. Yeah. For you now, in the growth environment that you're at, like, what are some of the key metrics that you look at?
Well, key metrics that we look at, firstly today is volume of hires. Right?
Volume of hires?
Yeah, volume of, we're in a growth-based environment. Yeah. We've just announced 1,000 net new roles. There's probably going to be a few more than that. But then if you include a number of other roles that come up, backfills and kind of changes, there's a huge amount, right? Yeah. So this quarter, volume of hires is really important for us. And how we measure volume of hires is actually what we call like pace to goal. Yeah. Right? So how much of the quarter have we had? Is it 30%, 60%, 70%, whatever it is? And then how are we tracking progress to goal? Yeah. Right. So that's progress to goal is kind of is one metric. The other.
So to break it down, as an example, you need to hire 300 people this quarter. You've done 200 hires so far, so you're 2/3 on the way to meet your quota.
Yeah.
And then you look at where you are during those 3 months. Yeah, so if you're on track.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me break it down. So if you have 300 hires per quarter, that's 100 hires a month. Yeah. Right. So then okay, well, how many recruiter screens do I need to do? What is my conversion rate from recruiter screen to hire? Yeah. Because then you can say, okay, well, if I need to do 10% of all hires that need to be done, I need to get to 3,000 recruiter screens in order to then get to 300 hires with that 10% conversion, right? Similarly, what is your conversion metric at hiring manager screen, right? What is your conversion metric on team interview, final interview, or case study, etc.? And you can see your funnel conversion, right? So then you know, are you ahead of where you need to be or behind in terms of your top of funnel recruiter activity or team interviews or source candidates, whatever it is. So you can then say, okay, well, we've just launched a number of these new roles. We have it. It's not going to be equal of 100, 100, 100. You start to say, well, the priority is top of funnel. We need to do the recruiter screens first because they're all new roles, right? Then it's okay, well, as the pipeline matures, then what about the team interviews? And as then it starts to mature, and you get into that cadence and that run rate, and then you start to see your hires play more. So you can then see, okay, well, I'm at 50% of the recruiter calls that I needed to do. I should be at 30%, so we're on track. If I then look at the conversion rates, how are we tracking against the team interviews and all of these other areas, you can actually start to tell the story of, these are new pipelines. They're coming through. We've done our conversion rates that we needed to do over here. The conversion optimization is kind of working quite well, or it could be off. So you're able to identify the main problems, and ultimately, where are you in terms of offers, conversion rates from offers, hires, etc., etc. And that's really powerful reporting that a lot of senior leaders actually want to know. They don't necessarily want to know, is the role filled? They want to know, do I have confidence that the team are going to fill it within XYZ period of time? And it's really that confidence piece that I find is really important, not just what the number is. So pace to goal is one of the big areas that we really drill down on, because it has a number of different offshoots, as I've just mentioned. Pace of hiring and candidate experience, I think is one of those metrics that you typically always tend to kind of center on.
And pace of hiring, you mean time to hire?
Yeah, time to hire. So we look at it from a couple of different aspects. So when was the role opened versus when it was hired, right? But equally, like, known candidates to hire. So when they come into your funnel, from an application or referral or sourced, whatever it is. When you know the candidate, what is the time before they're kind of hired, right? And you want to know a couple of areas. You want to know, what is the interviewing cadence in order to make a decision of, do we want to offer? And then from offer through to hired, that's the other metric. Because if you're taking 2.5 weeks to generate the contract back and forth in terms of offer negotiation, all of these things, then that should be disconnected from time to hire. Right? So that's the second metric that we tend to kind of center down on. You then look at the candidate experience, and then you break that down into, well, what are the main buckets of what candidates are really excited about or not excited about during the interviewing kind of process. Because then you can harmonize and refactor a lot of your processes, right? It's the same for hiring manager surveys as well, right? To be able to ascertain quality of hire is an important one for us. How I tend to think about it.
How do you measure that?
It's a big one. So I personally don't believe that you can measure and own a quality of hire metric within TA. I think you have to measure quality of process, and quality of process for us is, what are the skills you're looking for? How do you evaluate them? When do you evaluate them? In what format should you evaluate them, either from an interview or from an exercise or code review or whatever it is? And then who should evaluate them, right? And then as you then roll that into, okay, well, we've hired someone, right? What was our impression of functional skills, functional practices, behaviors, business impact? How do you measure those and getting really strong, solid feedbacks submitted, right? And then when it does work out or doesn't work out, whatever it is, how do you then deep dive into it and say, hey, we thought that this person would be really great and they weren't. Well, why is that? Because our interviewing processes are a bit off if their abilities aren't matching what we thought that they would be. Equally, there's also a lot of insights of, we thought this candidate would be kind of good, like soft yes versus kind of strong yes, right? But actually some of those people tend to be, the highest performing people, right? So why is that? So what should you do more of, and what should you change? And I think that's a consistent question that you need to always be asking, right?
In terms of where you are now? Like, what is one of the biggest challenges that you're currently facing as a leader?
The biggest challenges, I mean, there's a lot. So right now for us, it's really about we've got a fairly decent sized kind of recruiting team, etc. It's getting kind of all aligned in terms of talent acquisition enablement and also interviewer kind of enablement, right? And what are the resources and how do you build programs around that where there hasn't historically been programs that have always kind of been built, right? So I think that those are one of the challenges: recruiting operations, having the right data, the right insights, being able to connect those insights to an organization that has grown, right? And then we want to ask slightly different questions, right? So where do we see success in the sense of kind of retention, quality of hire? Where do we need to double down on? Where do we need to, what is the data showing us when you look at functional skills, practices, behaviors, business impact? Who ranks strongly in the interviewing process, and what data and insights can we then draw to then say, hey, this is, we should be targeting here or here or here. So that could be country, that could be industry. I'll give you an example. Within our sales organization, for instance, there's some really great people working at the big tech kind of companies, right? If you look at LinkedIn, if you look at Google, if you look at all these other places, but we see a lot of success actually in the would-like product versus the must-have product. So LinkedIn is a must-have product, right? So are their salespeople the best, or are they, is it a must-have product, right? And what's the complexity of the sale? So we actually see a little bit more, we see people doing really well that have come from the would-like sale as opposed to the must-have sale. Right, not to discount people at LinkedIn and other areas, like please come and join us. There's opportunities kind of everywhere, right? But when you move into kind of that objective hiring, you tend to see, well, hey, like, let's not just go for the kind of the Halo CV, right? Let's have a look at a number of different backgrounds and be very objective on how to hire, and double down on your top of the funnel, right? Because that's where you're going to get the most conversion.
Alan, as our final closing question, what is something that you would like to share with our audience that are inspiring leaders or recent leaders in that sense? Like, what is something that you feels like you wish you would have maybe known like early on or something? Yeah, just as a kind of final thought.
I think I've always tried to really understand the fundamentals of the business as kind of number one, in order to have like that business kind of conversation and a real strategic conversation in which you can then align the people resource to delivering kind of business kind of goals. And so that's something that I think is very close to my heart. In terms of kind of advice, like what would I give? Advice is just to be curious, asking the right questions, and it comes to mind. There was a book actually. So I would encourage everyone to read a book called Radical Candor. Right. So I love that book.
Classic.
Right. And I really like the care personally and challenge directly, I think is the
Love it.
Read the book.
Love it. Alan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights and your feedback. And let's get ready for our recruitment leadership events.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers.